Well, good morning, church. So we're going to do something a little bit different today, although I think we've done some things together. We've been looking at the book of Ephesians and talking about the call that God has on every one of our lives, and that call is to use the gifts that He's given to us, the person that He's created each of us to be, for His glory. That's our call. Your call, my call, all of our calls to lift up God for His glory. And then the path that we take is very different and distinct for each of us, how we do that. And so Pastor Patina and myself are going to be talking a little bit today about the lives that we've lived and the paths that we've taken, both very different one to another, for our time, not just in ministry, but all the other things that are part of our life. Each week in this series, we've covered a chapter. Jeff just read to us from the 6th chapter of Ephesians about putting on the armor of God and why that's such a necessary part of responding to God's call and walking our path. So I mentioned that Pastor Patina and I have walked very different paths in our ministry and also the life that we live. So let me just real quickly, or as quickly as I can, tell you about my path and how that came to be. I was raised in the church. I mean, from my earliest memories, before my earliest memories of church, I was baptized in a United Methodist Church. Those of you here this morning that know Bonnie Detman, Bonnie's a sweetheart, a member of our church. Bonnie's husband, George, was my pastor, who was the pastor who baptized me as an infant. So that's how far back I go in the United Methodist Church. I was raised by godly parents to be in church whenever the doors were open. My experience of feeling saved or making that decision in my life happened in junior high. Some of you may know that as middle school, but it was junior high when I went through it. And I went to the Warren Willis Youth Camp, as I'd been before, but the pastor that night talked about the relationship with Jesus Christ in a way that, for the first time in my life, I said, not only do I want that, I need that. I need that kind of relationship in my life. So I became a believer in junior high. What's interesting is I went through high school and then into college. I didn't always live in such a way that believing led to following. And that really is a necessary part of our path. If we're going to answer the call of God to glorify Him, we have to walk like a follower of Jesus. So I lived for years firmly as a believer, but not much of a follower. Now, when I went to college, I was fortunate enough that I went to college, a small college in Winter Haven, Florida, on a little basketball scholarship. And it was the only reason I went to college, because basketball was all I wanted to do. It was the only reason why higher education would continue to exist for Brian James, was so I could keep playing basketball. And what happened for me, I know you guys are all looking at me going, he doesn't look like he ever played basketball, but...
Miracles do happen.
That's right. That's right. Luckily, it was before video, so there's no proof that I wasn't as good as I say I was. So I had a really significant injury to my knee when I was working at the Methodist Youth Camp in Fruitland Park. And so my basketball days all of a sudden were over. But I still had college. And all of a sudden college it had to mean something, because it couldn't just be playing basketball anymore. What's my life going to be like? What am I supposed to do? So I'd never had to take those kind of questions to God before. I'd always just sort of figured it out on my own. And all of a sudden, I had nowhere to go with that. As a believer, but not a follower, I didn't know, what do you do? So I just literally began to pour out my heart to God. God, I don't have any answers. God, I'm afraid. God, I'm confused. And so this whole time I'm working at this youth camp with these kids. I was teaching water skiing. And what teaching water skiing was for me was, for the entire summer, for 3 hours every afternoon, I dragged students around the lake. It was really controlled drowning is what it was. But I enjoyed it. But when everybody would go away, I'd just be there with my future in doubt. And so one evening, I was sitting out on the ski raft. Everybody else had left. And I'm just pouring my heart out to God. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do about this. And I know if somebody was sitting right beside me, they wouldn't have told you that they heard a voice, but I did. And God clearly told me that I was supposed to do ministry for my life. Now, I interpreted that as pastor, and that seemed impossible to me because no pastors looked like me or talked like me or acted like me. But even more than that, I had a tremendous speech impediment at that time in my life. And it caused me to have so much ill at ease in social settings. The idea of being around people and having to talk was just unimaginable to me. But I had this call on my life to do ministry. So this is when I thought you could make deals with God, that God, I'd make the deal and God would live into it. Like God just says, no, I'll do most of that. So I thought, well, I'm going to be a pastoral counselor or a hospital chaplain or something on a small scale where I don't have to be around a lot of people. And hey, God, you keep opening the doors, I'll keep going through them, and I'm sure it'll end at a place that I'm comfortable. Yeah. So I go off to graduate school, and I'm having trouble making rent. So I end up getting a job basically as a bar back in a little dive place off the edge of the Emory campus there. And so one night I'm just popping tops for beers and this group of girls come in. And they're at the bar, and so I ask them what they would like. And one of the girls says to me, there is a religious reason I'm telling you the story, by the way. People are like, this is starting to go really bad. But she says to me, you have the worst speech impediment I've ever heard. And I said, if that's your pickup line, you really need to work on that. Well, she wasn't at all trying to pick me up. I should have known better than that. But she said, I am a grad student in the speech pathology department, and I think I can help you. And so from that moment on, every week, I would get together with Robin for 3 years, and the result of that was I still struggle with the anxiety of being in front of people every time we do services. But Robin, this girl that I just happened to randomly bump into, enabled me to live into this calling that I couldn't even imagine.
Well, so randomly bumped into.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I realized when you were telling this story is that you said yes in your fear. Like when you said yes to God, you had this anxiety and a speech impediment, and God was calling you to do something in spite of that, like you didn't think you could, and then you just said yes. And as a result of saying yes, then God provided a way for you to do that. That's amazing.
Yeah, no, but so I began to pastor in United Methodist churches, and eventually that journey took me to a church in Tampa called St. James. And I had not been there all that long. I was trying to put together a staff, and this family came, this Mrs. Patino Ripke and her husband Jim and their children started coming to our church. And Mrs. Ripke started singing in the traditional church choir, and she was very faithful in her participation. And so the day came where we were looking for a contemporary worship leader, and so we reached out to Mrs. Ripke and asked her if she would be on the search team. And we interviewed for months. We interviewed every type and stripe of worship leader you could imagine, barefooted, three-piece suits,
Literally.
Everything. Oh my gosh, the frustration level, week after week. And it went on for months. We could not find. And so I was praying about it, just continually praying about this. And then this voice again said to me, she's already here. And Patina was the one that God put in my mind. So I reached out to her, and I'm going to let her take the story from there.
Well, I'm going to do a rewind real quick because my story, my path begins very young. I was 14. And there's the scripture that talks about that we can make all the plans, but then God gives us the path. And so that's what I did. And I had to do a project for school a couple months ago, and I had to write down my story on a timeline, my personal testimony and my call story. And so it was really an amazing experience. And I made a super detailed timeline. And what I realized when I was doing that is that my path has been a series of stages. And coming out of the stages, I've learned something about God. And so you can see some of it up there, and I'll talk about high level what these stages were to me. The first stage, I became a Christian. I surrendered my life to Jesus when I was 14 years old. And at that point, nobody really told me what I was supposed to do. I just innately knew I wanted to read the Bible. So I started reading the Bible, and as I read the Bible, the scriptures came to life to me, like the one about when Peter was walking on the water, and that when the Bible says that he started sinking and he said, "Lord, save me," and Jesus reached out his hand immediately. That immediately, when I read that, just went right into my spirit. I knew God was speaking to me, and that's how the whole Bible was when I read it. I didn't know that, like, God spoke. I didn't understand the Holy Spirit. I was, for about 5 years, I was just learning about God on my own. I was going to church, a little Baptist church. I was praying one night. I was in my bedroom, just reading the Bible, and got down on the side of my bed and started praying. And then I stopped praying, and I was just thinking about how amazing God was. And in that moment, I didn't know what was happening. The presence of God came in my bedroom and was so powerful and so strong that the feeling scared me. And not like scary monster, right, but like our God is the most powerful, awesome God. And I kept opening my eyes and looking around the room, and this presence never went away. And finally, he just ebbed away. And for 5 years, it was like that for me. And I say that's when I learned that God delights in me. And I continued walking with the Lord, and then I started dating someone, and something didn't feel right. And I remember asking God, is this the right person for me to date? I was about 19, 20 years old, and I'm just asking something wasn't right. Finally, I was talking to my dad about it, and I said, Dad, what do you think? Am I supposed to be dating this person? And when my dad said this, he said, I don't believe this is God's best for you. When he spoke those words, the same thing happened. Like every cell in my body, I heard God say that my dad was speaking truth. And so I heard what he said and thought about it and pondered it. And then I ended up not listening to God, and I got married. And this is when I started learning that God's ways are best, because I ended up moving to Chattanooga, Tennessee. I lived in a really, really bad part of town across the street from where a drug dealer lived. There was traffic in and out of there all the time. Shauna was born. She was a baby. I had my electricity turned off numerous times. My husband at that time, who is now deceased, my ex-husband, he was an alcoholic. I was trying to get money. I was making $4 an hour, working 30 hours a week. That's what we lived on. I had people throw a brick through the front window. I had another night someone broke it. I mean, this is no joke. And I remember laying on the floor crying, saying, God, why did you do this to me? And it's funny how we do that. But I finally called my dad, and he came and got me and Shauna and my mom, and we stayed with them. And then my dad died, and it was a very difficult time for me. But I learned when I looked back, I realized that God had warned me. Like, God wasn't telling me not to do something because he was trying to be an ugly, nasty God and an ogre. God was saying, listen, I'm warning you. I'm trying to prevent you from taking a step here. And I took it anyway. But I started learning that God's ways are best. And then I went through this period of time of guilt and shame, and I made mistakes, and what am I going to do? But I ended up getting married and starting my life over again. That's when I started going back to church. And that's when I really had an amazing dream I've talked about, where I learned that even though I made mistakes in my past, and God knew exactly what I did, he knew who I was then, and he knew what I was going to do in the future, that he was there. I learned that God never lets go. He was never going to let go of me. He said he was proud of me. So that's when I really learned that lesson, and I began to thrive again. Like, all of that stuff from my past started evaporating and going away. And I went on with my life, and still, and I'm not seeking ministry. I'm just seeking God. in my life and working. And then I had this big event, and most of you went through it, 9/11, and the Twin Towers came down. I worked at a research and development company. And in that company, everybody was scared. We thought, we're going to be targeted. And I'm sure many of you who work in companies like that, if you worked in that company back then, you know what I'm talking about. And at that time also my boss left, who was just like my second father after my father had gone. And my grandmother died. I had my really, really good friend I worked with and coworker, she was in the cubicle next to me. She fell down the stairs and hit her head on the floor and died. And I remember driving to work thinking, God, actually I wasn't even praying. I just remember thinking, I don't know how to pray. I was so sad. I didn't know how to pray. And I felt literal arms around me. I was in the car. I felt arms hugging me. And I knew that God was with me. And I knew that God was never going to leave me alone. No matter what happened in my life, no matter how bad it got, that God was there. Still, I'm just seeking God and going through life. We ended up moving to Tampa in 2002. And when I moved to Tampa, it was the first time that I hadn't worked. So, from the time I was 13 years old, I was always working, doing something, trying to make some money. So we moved into this beautiful home because of my husband's job. And I would spend the entire day reading the Bible and singing and playing the piano, because I didn't do that. Like, I wasn't like in a church playing the piano or singing. I was maybe in a choir singing here and there. I spent hours doing that. And God changed me changed dramatically from the inside out. Like, all of my pain, discovered some things about me that I didn't know, like why I was acting like I was in situations with my mom and all kinds of stuff. Forgiving people, asking God to forgive me. It was incredible. It was like the big cleanse, in a good way. And so, of sin.
Yeah, that sounded like it was going bad.
It went bad. It was going down like really fast. But God changed everything, and that's when I started going to church. And when we moved to Tampa, the first week, I asked I'm like asking at the grocery store. I'm asking people taking a walk. I'm total strangers saying, "What's a good church around here?" Every single one of them, without question, said, "You should try St. James. I've never been to St. James before, but you should try it." That probably happened about 10 times. And so I went, okay, I think I'll try St. James. So I went to St. James, and Pastor Brian was preaching that Sunday. It was packed. The church was always packed. It was a pretty big church, and I could barely get a seat. And it was the Sunday after his son Eli was born. And what did you say? You were talking about you had a guest?
I was talking about how we had this intruder invade our house, and they'd made all sorts of demands and threatened us, and this big long tale. And finally, I told him his name is Elijah James, and he's our new baby, because that's what babies do. They just So anyway, we had some fun with that. And,
so when he said that, I knew that was the church. That's what made me know you have to have a good sense of humor. And so I stayed in the church, and he was talking about how that God just hired or placed me in that church, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if it wasn't for Pastor Brian. And I say that with total humility, and I don't even understand God.
Just a phone call. I called her on the phone and said, "I think you're supposed to do this job."
Yeah, it's the first time I couldn't speak. He goes, "Patina, why don't you go pray about that?" I'm like, click. Literally, yeah, it was very serious. But I'd never led a band. I'd never led worship. I'd never led vocal teams. I sang a little bit here and there. I never worked in a church. I never wanted to work in a church. But God knew how he made me and what he was preparing me for. So I stayed there for 3 years, and I'm still as a worship leader. And God moved me. God moved me, and I resigned. We were supposed to move and go back up north because of my husband's job. And then we had a really big crack in the house. It wasn't a sinkhole, but the people who had a contract on our house thought it was a sinkhole or was going to be a sinkhole. So the whole thing fell through, and I'm still in Florida. It's amazing. And so about a year period of time went by, and I didn't know what God wanted me to do. It's kind of weird how that happens. You just kind of wander around. And that's what I did. And miraculously, I ended up in a church in Temple Terrace, and it was a small church. and it was multicultural, and the pastor was from Barbados. It was a completely different experience for me, but I really, really learned a lot there. And the pastor there, he used to always call me pastor. I'm like, why are you calling me pastor? He goes, what's wrong? I'm like, I don't want you to call. He goes, are you afraid? Like, what are you afraid of? I'm not afraid. Don't call me pastor. Just stop it. And so we would argue literally all the time about it. And what happened was he saw that in me. And then in 2012, I've talked a lot about that year where, it started out with my mother-in-law dying, my uncle dying, my sister telling me she had brain cancer, my husband's job hanging in the balance. This all happened on a weekend. And that was January. And my whole year it seemed like every week, every month, every time we kept thinking, could it get any worse? And that's when I went through this really big time of suffering. And it was really hard. And when my sister died in December of that year, I went to her funeral in January, and one of her former pastors was saying, I don't know if you know this about your sister, but your sister was called to preach, and she never would because they didn't affirm her. She was a Baptist. So I would say, well, why don't you bring a strong devotion? And she'd roll her eyes and go, okay, fine. He goes, but she was called to preach. He didn't know what he was saying to me, because what he said to me, the Spirit of God took that and said, you're in a church that affirms women and believes in the call of women to be pastors in a church. And it was like he spanked me, like, get back down there and go do something about it. So that's what I did in 2013. I finally said, I'm answering this call to be a pastor and to preach and to step into the call that God has for me at this time. So what I want to say about that time in my life is, God, what I learned about that is God prepares us in suffering. So God prepared me to lean in, that he would walk with me. But in the suffering, I heard the call of God. I mean, it's a weird thing to say, but if you're suffering, it doesn't mean that God's not with you, but he's teaching you to his character. He's trying to teach you to become more like him. And I had a lot of character building, I guess, to do. So I went through a big time of suffering.
So you have somebody who's called to ministry, who you bring on your staff. The church is literally just kind of blowing up with people. We were doing really significant things. Literally, Bettina and I had just gotten back from South Africa, where we reopened a school there and a hospice clinic, and things like that were happening all through our ministry. And you have people on your staff that are just sold out for the call of glorifying God with their gifts. And you say, well, and you were raised in the church. You're perfect for that. You have the perfect staff. What could go wrong with that? How did that go off track? Well, the reality is that we can walk a path sometimes that looks like exactly the path that God would want people to walk. But if our goal isn't the call, which is to glorify God with our gifts, if we become the one that we want to glorify, then the path can go horribly wrong. And that's what happened for me, to be completely transparent with you. I was doing lots of good stuff, but I was doing it because I believed that I was good at it, that's what was making everything work, that's what made the church what it was. It was for my glory. My call was to me. And that's not the path that God can ever honor when we choose to walk it that way. The call is always for his glory. And so what happened is that I destroyed a lot of relationships with people, went through some really tough stuff with my marriage. An issue with pornography people became aware of it within the life of the church. And so I resigned, and it was really ugly. It was on the front page of the paper there in Tampa, a couple of the different papers, and all sorts of news coverage for that kind of thing when it happens. And so it was really ugly. And so what happened in the midst of that was all these relationships and people that I let down, and all the shame that goes with that. Chip Ingram, if you're reading the book that we're doing now, talks about issues of shame and regret, and how those are the things that we battle. You see, Satan didn't have to do anything to me. Satan just had to let me be what I could be on my own. And that's when it became all about me. And God just couldn't honor that. So for over a year, I was out of the ministry. After 21 years, I couldn't do anything within the life of the church for a vocation. So I ended up putting in hardwood floors and landscaping and throwing newspapers and whatever I could do, living apart from the family. They had to move up north. It was really a tough time for us. And for the first time in 21 years, I had to decide if I should go to church or not. It wasn't my job anymore. I had to decide if I was going to participate in mission work. I had to, because that was always part of the job. It wasn't like I decided that I was going to go help the homeless or, feed the hungry. That was part of the job. Now it was like, am I really called to do that? Is that really my path? Because I may never get to pastor again. Well, I had an amazing year of ministry in the year that I was out of ministry. And so, coming out of that, just a phenomenal thing happened. I was doing all these other things and worshiping at this tiny little church that used to be one of our mission partners. And a church from Lakeland called. Little African-American church, a St. Mark United Methodist Church, tiny. And they asked me if I would come and just serve there as an interim. They didn't want me to stick around forever. You guys know how that is, right? And it was amazing. They were so sweet and wonderful and loving. And so I got to refocus on my call, which was to use gifts to glorify God, put me back on a path that didn't just look like the right path, it was the right path. And so fast forward, now we're here. And somebody who was totally committed as a lay person, who was gifted in music, has now become a fully vested and amazing pastor, and I get to do ministry with her every day. You see, coming out of all that, on my worst day, I get to do this job. I get to walk this path. So I don't know where you all are at. I know what your call is. Your call is to use your gifts and graces, the person that God has made you to be, to glorify Him. Now, I don't know what area of your life you're excelling in that, what areas in your life you're struggling with. See, we have all these different paths that we're walking. There's the path that I walk of being a spouse. There's the path being a parent, the path of being a pastor, the path of being a friend. And you have to walk all of those for God's glory. So I know you walk a lot of different paths. Some of you may have paths that you're struggling on. These two pastors know what that looks like. So my hope is that in hearing where we've been and some of what we've been through, that you can understand that we all have this amazing call on our lives. And we all walk paths sometimes that cause us to struggle. We cause ourselves to struggle. It's the reason that Paul offers up this prayer. The 6th chapter of Ephesians, finally, be strong in the Lord, in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God. We've been talking about that all through the service. Jeff read it a moment ago. We put this on because the things that we battle are the things that we battle inside of us. Satan doesn't have to do anything to the outside of us. He just has to let us be who we are on the inside of us. So anyway, I know I'm getting preachy, but that's
it's
what
your
we do,
call.
right? That's my path.
Well, in closing, what I just realized is that when you heard from God and you were scared because you weren't equipped, you felt. When I heard from God, I was scared because I wasn't equipped. So if you're scared, then you're probably the person right now who God is calling to do something. The other thing is, neither one of us were trying to become what we are. So I wasn't thinking I was going to become a pastor. You weren't either. I wasn't trying to become a worship leader. It just happened. So the point is that picture that we showed in the call, the picture that I got when I was up in northern Wisconsin with the woods and the trees, it's really, when I talked about that when I saw that photograph and I asked the photographer the name of it, he said, because I called him, I bought it and I called him, and the name of it is The Path I Chose. And I said, why did you call it The Path I Chose? There's not a path. And he kind of chuckled. He goes, well, if you look very closely, he said, you can see that there is a path that the deer, that they have, it's super tiny and you can barely see it. And when I realized that, I'm like, that's the path that we're on. Not the forest, it looks like it's impossible, but it's down on the ground and looking at the footprints. And that's really what we're called to do, is just one yes at a time, one little yes, whatever it is. And our paths are continuing, our call is continuing. And one day we're not going to be on this type of a platform or a stage, but our call continues until we go to glory. And it's to glorify God in everything we do.
Amen.